Space isn't dark. Space isn't cold. Space is listening. Every signal we have ever sent into the void, every radio burst, every transmission, every desperate attempt to prove we are not alone has traveled outward at the speed of light. And something heard us. The problem isn't that we made contact. The problem is that we made contact in 1978, and nobody told you. Because the crew manifest said 7. The audio log said 8. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is not speculation, it is a transcript pulled from a classified government archive by a man who was never supposed to find it, a man who lost his job the morning after he did. This is Grim Feed Files, and tonight we go to Houston. Mission logs don't lie. They are precise, clinical, time-stamped to the millisecond. Crew manifests don't lie either. 7 men entered that simulation chamber in Houston, Texas in the spring of 1978. 7 men were logged in, 7 men were logged out. But the audio recording counted 8. Part 1. The Routine. My name is David. I was 29 when I found it. I want to be precise about that, 29, because I think it matters somehow. I think the version of me that existed before that night and the version that has existed since are different enough that the age functions almost like a border, a before and after. 29 before, something else after. I worked the night shift at a third-party contracting firm in Houston, Texas. We were not NASA. We were adjacent, was the word my supervisor used. Adjacent. We handled the archival overflow, the physical media that NASA's own facilities did not have the bandwidth to process. Old magnetic tapes, reel-to-reel audio logs, paper documents yellowing in humidity-controlled storage rooms that smelled of iron and slow decay. Our job was to digitize them, to take things that were dying and make them permanent. I believed in that work. I want to say that clearly before everything else. I believed in the preservation of memory. I thought there was something almost sacred about it, the idea that a moment recorded could outlast the people who lived it, that voices from decades ago could be pulled forward into the present and made legible again. I thought I was doing something that mattered. I do not think about it that way anymore. The room where I worked was cold, deliberately so, because the equipment ran hot and the climate control was set to compensate, which meant that by midnight the temperature in the archival processing bay had dropped to something that required a second layer. I wore the same gray hoodie every shift for 8 months. It still smells faintly of stale coffee and recycled air and something I cannot name, a metallic undertone that I associate now, inescapably, with the sensation of realizing something is wrong. The fluorescent lights above my workstation hummed, not loudly, but at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious annoyance. You stop noticing it after the first hour, or rather, you stop noticing it in the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. It did not disappear, it simply became the baseline, the texture of silence in that room. Years later, I read somewhere that fluorescent lights hum at 60 hertz in the United States, the frequency of the alternating current that powers them, 60 cycles per second. I have never been able to sit under fluorescent lights since without counting. The night shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I was usually alone by 1 in the morning. The data entry technicians finished their logs and went home. The security guard did his rounds and settled into his booth by the front entrance, and the building reduced itself to its essential sounds. The hum of the lights, the low mechanical breath of the HVAC system, the occasional distant clank of pipes settling in the walls, and my own footsteps when I walked to the break room to refill my coffee, which was terrible, burned, and overcycled. It was the kind of coffee that exists not to be enjoyed, but simply to hold off the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from sitting still in a cold room at 2 in the morning, doing precise, careful work that requires you to stay awake. I had been doing this for 14 months when I found the tape. 14 months of magnetic reels and paper logs and audio files hissing with the analog decay of decades. 14 months of mission data, engineering reports, communication transcripts, weather observation logs, personnel records from programs that no longer existed and facilities that had been demolished. 14 months of the past, feeding through my headphones, night after night. I had heard a great deal by that point. I had heard astronauts talking about their families during rest periods. I had heard engineers arguing about fuel ratios in the flat, controlled language of men who argue about numbers for a living. I had heard a recording of a woman crying softly in what I assumed was an office, the microphone clearly left running by accident, the weeping lasting for 6 minutes before the tape clicked off. I had heard a great many things that felt private, or strange, or quietly sad. I was not, in other words, a person who startled easily by that point. The tape was logged as ComSim 1978 APR 7. Communication Simulation, April 1978, 7 participants. It had arrived in my batch as part of a larger set of sealed boxes from a storage facility in Clear Lake, the area near the Johnson Space Center, where a great deal of ancillary program material had been warehoused since the late 70s and early 80s. The boxes had been sitting in that facility for 40 years. Nobody had opened them. Nobody had flagged them as significant. They were simply part of the accumulated weight of an institution that generates documentation the way weather generates precipitation, constantly, in all directions, much of it going unobserved. I loaded the reel at approximately 2:45 in the morning. The room was quiet. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. The fluorescent light above my station was cycling through one of its periodic fluctuations, a subtle dimming and brightening, so slow as to be almost imperceptible, that happened every night around this time, and that I had learned meant the building's power draw was shifting as something elsewhere in the facility cycled on or off. The light never quite steadied. It just breathed slowly above my head. I put on my monitoring headphones and I pressed play. The discovery. The first thing you hear on the tape is static, not the aggressive static of a corrupted file. This is the soft, living static of magnetic tape that has been sitting in a box for 44 years. It has texture. It breathes. It sounds, if you listen to it with the gain turned up, almost like the inside of a seashell, a low, curved rush of white noise that suggests depth without revealing it. Then the voices begin, 7 of them, checking in, one by one. The protocol was precise, each man stating his designation, his station, his system status. Clear, professional, unhurried. The voices of people who have done this before and will do it again and are not particularly interested in the documentation of their own competence. I began logging the metadata, dimension, tape condition, number of participants. I wrote 7 in the participant field. I noted the audio quality as moderate, some degradation in the mid-frequency range, expected for tape of this age and storage history. I noted the static baseline as consistent. I noted the check-in protocol as standard for the period. Then something happened. Between the 5th and 6th check-in, in a gap of maybe 4 seconds, the ordinary silence of one man finishing and another preparing to begin, there was a sound. Not static, not tape noise, not any artifact of magnetic decay that I had learned to recognize over 14 months of archival work. A sound that had shape, that had direction, that had underneath its surface the unmistakable architecture of human speech. I stopped writing. I rewound. 4 seconds. I listened again. It was quiet, quieter than the 7 official voices, lower in the mix, sitting beneath the ambient hum of whatever equipment was running in that simulation chamber. If I had been listening at normal gain, I would have missed it entirely. But I was running my monitoring software at elevated sensitivity because the tape had some degradation in the mid-range, and I was compensating. And at that gain, with my headphones pressed against my ears in a cold, silent room at 2:45 in the morning, at that gain, I heard it. A voice, calm, unhurried, speaking with the flat precision of someone reciting information rather than asking a question. And what it said in that 4-second gap between the 5th and 6th crew check-in on a tape from April of 1978 in a simulation chamber in Houston, Texas, what it said was this: "How long have I been here?" Not a question. The sentence had no arc. It landed like a statement of fact being offered for confirmation, the way you might say, "I have been waiting for an hour." Not asking, reporting. I sat very still. The 6th crew member checked in. The 7th checked in. The simulation proceeded. Mission parameters were reviewed. System statuses were confirmed. The 7 official voices moved through their protocol with the ease of repetition, and underneath them, in the gaps, in the silences between one statement and the next, I listened. 31 minutes into the tape, the 8th voice spoke again. The 7 crew were running a relay sequence, each man reading a series of confirmation codes in turn, passing the signal around the room in a circle, a test of sequential communication under simulated deep space lag conditions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The codes were read, confirmed, reread. The sequence looped. And in the pause after the 7th man's confirmation, in the breath of silence before the sequence would loop back to the first, the 8th voice said, "Is anyone coming back?" Same quality, same flat, unhurried calm, same absence of interrogative inflection. Not, "Is anyone coming back?" with the rising pitch of hope. "Is anyone coming back?" with the level tone of a person who has moved past expecting an answer and is now simply recording the question for its own sake. I pulled my headphones off. I set them on the desk. I looked at my monitoring screen for a long time, at the waveform scrolling across the display, its peaks and valleys mapping a conversation from 44 years ago, including 2 peaks that did not correspond to any of the 7 listed crew members. 2 peaks that were real, that were physical, that were records of air actually moving in the shape of words. Sound is physics. A waveform is not a hallucination. I looked at the file header. I had not looked at it carefully when I loaded the tape because there had been nothing to suggest I needed to. The header contained the standard metadata: designation, date, participant count, program affiliation. I looked at it now. The date on the file header was not April 1978. It was April 1981. The tape was labeled 1978. The simulation it claimed to document had occurred in 1978. The crew manifest attached to it confirmed 1978. The mission this simulation was preparing for, a long-duration deep space communications protocol test, had concluded in late 1978. All 7 crew members returned safely, program archived, facility decommissioned in 1978. The date stamp on the audio file I was currently listening to was April 1981, 3 years later, 3 years after the program had ended, 3 years after the crew had come home, 3 years of a sealed simulation chamber sitting in Houston, Texas, its equipment powered down, its doors locked, its contents waiting in the dark. I sat in that cold room under the humming fluorescent light for a very long time, listening to the rest of the tape. The 8th voice spoke 2 more times. At 53 minutes, "I can hear you." At 1 hour 41 minutes, near the end of the recording, it said something that I have replayed in my mind every night since. It said, "I know you will find this." And then 4 minutes later, the tape ended.
The Unsettling Details. I did not sleep when I got home that morning. I live in a small apartment about 20 minutes from the facility, a second-floor unit in a building that was constructed in the late 90s. It has the specific character of buildings from that era, a kind of functional beigeness that expresses no ambition beyond providing interior space. I sat at my kitchen table with the windows letting in the early morning light, that thin, flat light that comes before the sun fully clears the horizon, the light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself, and I thought. The voice did not name itself. That was the first thing I turned over. In every audio log I had processed, human beings named themselves. Even in informal communications, even in casual conversation, people identified themselves, because identification is a social reflex so deep that it is nearly involuntary. Identity is the baseline of human communication. The eighth voice had no name, had no designation, did not, in any of its four utterances, identify itself or its origin or its relationship to the crew it was apparently observing. It spoke as though identification were either impossible or irrelevant, as though the only information it had to offer was the information contained in those questions. How long? Is anyone coming back? I can hear you. I know you will find this, and nothing beyond that. The questions themselves. I sat with them for a long time, turning them over the way you turn over an object you have found on the ground, looking for the thing that explains it. How long have I been here? A question about duration, about time perceived from the inside of an experience, time that has become unmeasured, that has lost its external markers. The question of something that no longer has access to clocks or light cycles or the social rhythms that humans use to track the passage of hours. Is anyone coming back? Not, is anyone there? Not, can anyone hear me? Coming back. The phrasing implies a before, a time when people were present, a departure that had occurred, a gap between that departure and the present moment of the question, something that had witnessed the crew arriving and the crew leaving and had been in that interval between the departure, something that wanted to know if the interval was permanent. I can hear you. This one I kept returning to most often because of its structure. Not I hear you, present tense, describing a current state of reception. I can hear you, capability rather than action, as though the voice were making a declaration about its nature, establishing a fact for the record. I am capable of perceiving you. I am receiving your transmissions. Whatever you are doing in this chamber, whatever signals you are generating, they are reaching me. And then, I know you will find this. Future tense, spoken in 1981, addressed to someone who had not yet listened, spoken with the patience of something that had access to information about the future and was choosing to reveal only that the finding was inevitable, that the specific person who would eventually sit in a cold room at 2:45 in the morning with elevated gain on their monitoring headphones, that person was already accounted for, already known. I had been chosen as the recipient of a message before I was born. I turned that over for a long time in the thin morning light. Then I started looking at the technical details. The eighth voice was not recorded on the same frequency band as the 7 official crew voices. Human speech occupies a range, broadly speaking, from about 80 Hz on the low end to roughly 8,000 Hz on the high end. The 7 crew members occupied this range the way human voices always do, variable, warm, slightly different for each speaker, but recognizably within the architecture of the human vocal apparatus. The eighth voice was lower, not dramatically lower, not so far outside the human range as to be immediately obvious, but consistently and precisely lower. Every utterance, every syllable, all 4 statements across 1 hour and 41 minutes of tape fell within a narrow band that sat just beneath the comfortable lower threshold of normal human speech. It was the frequency of something that was either not quite human or was using an apparatus that was not quite a throat or was transmitting through a medium that shifted the pitch slightly in transit, the way sound shifts when it travels through water or through walls or through the particular quality of distance that exists between a source and a receiver that were never meant to be in direct communication. And when I matched the frequency against publicly available NASA radio band data, the charts of authorized transmission frequencies used for everything from mission communications to satellite telemetry to weather observation systems, the eighth voice did not appear. Not misallocated, not overlapping with a secondary band, not tucked into a gap between designated ranges, simply absent. The frequency the voice occupied was not on the chart. It was not a frequency that NASA used or acknowledged or had apparently ever found reason to assign. It was not broadcasting from Earth. It was coming in.
The corporate cover-up. I filed the report the following morning. I did not go into the office. My shift did not start until 10 p.m., and I saw no reason to wait. I wrote up the anomaly in the formal language of archival documentation. Unidentified audio signal in tape COM-SIM 1978 APR7. Date discrepancy between physical label and data header metadata. Voice artifact inconsistent with listed crew manifest. Frequency analysis suggests signal origin outside standard transmission parameters. I kept the language precise and professional and completely free of the words that were actually running through my head. I emailed it to my supervisor, whose name was Gregory Haynes. I copied the archival director and the data integrity officer as protocol required when flagging a potential authentication anomaly. I attached the relevant timestamps and the segment of audio I had isolated. I sent the email at 9:17 a.m., and then I made myself breakfast and I watched the news and I waited. Gregory called me at 11:40 a.m. He was calm. Gregory was always calm. That was his professional signature, a kind of deliberate evenness that I had always read as competence and was now reading differently. He said they had listened to the segment I had flagged. He said the team had reviewed the file header discrepancy. He said that what I had encountered was a known artifact of magnetic tape storage from that era, a phenomenon he called signal bleed, where fragments of a different recording on the same reel could imprint over the primary content, creating the impression of additional voices or sounds. He said this was well documented in archival science literature, and that the date discrepancy was almost certainly a data entry error from the original cataloging, which had been done by hand in the 1970s by people working under time pressure who made this exact kind of mistake all the time. He said the frequency anomaly I had noted was consistent with the degraded mid-range of the tape, that aged magnetic media often produced harmonic artifacts in the lower frequency bands that could, to an untrained ear, resemble structured audio. Untrained ear. I had been doing this for 14 months. I had processed over 6,000 tapes. I had documented more audio anomalies than I could count, true artifacts of tape degradation, real signal bleed, genuine corrupted data. I knew what those things sounded like. I knew the difference between a harmonic artifact and a voice that said, "I know you will find this." I said, "Did you listen to the whole file?" He said he had listened to enough. I said, "The fourth instance at 1 hour 41 minutes. Did you hear the fourth instance?" There was a pause, exactly the length of a breath held and released, and then Gregory said that the file had been flagged for removal from the active processing queue and would be reviewed by a technical committee, and that I should continue with my other assigned materials, and he appreciated my diligence, and the call ended. I reported for my shift that night at 10 p.m. as usual. I badged in at the security entrance. The reader accepted my badge. I walked to my workstation. I sat down. I opened my processing software. The software returned an authentication error. I assumed it was a glitch and tried again. Same error. I called IT from my desk phone, the internal line, the one that rings directly into their office.
A technician answered and asked for my employee number, and I gave it, and there was a silence of maybe 30 seconds while he looked at something on his screen, and then he said, "Your credentials have been suspended pending review." I asked what kind of review. He did not have that information. I asked who initiated the suspension. He did not have that information. I asked whether he could give me any information at all. He said I would need to contact HR. HR was closed. It was 10:20 p.m. I sat at a workstation in a cold room under fluorescent lights that hummed at 60 cycles per second, and I had no system access, and I had been there for 20 minutes, and already something was being assembled around me. The next morning, I received a letter by email, the efficiency of digital delivery making the formality of the language feel somehow more aggressive. The letter informed me that my employment had been terminated effective immediately. The stated reason was unauthorized retention of restricted archival material. It noted that I had been observed copying protected data from a secured government archive without written authorization, which constituted a violation of my employment agreement and applicable federal information security regulations. It informed me that legal counsel had been notified. It requested the return of all company equipment and copies of any materials I had retained within 14 calendar days. I read the letter 3 times. I was sitting at my kitchen table. It was 8 in the morning, and the light coming through my window was the ordinary flat light of a Houston Tuesday, the kind of light that carries no particular information about what the day will be. Traffic noise from the street below, a neighbor's television through the wall, the specific tinny quality of early morning news. All of it ordinary, all of it indifferent to what the email on my screen was telling me. The phrase that I kept returning to was restricted archival material. The tape had not been marked restricted when I pulled it from the batch. I had checked multiple times, because after receiving Gregory's call, I had wanted to be certain I had not misread anything. The tape's catalog entry listed it as standard archival material, Level 2 access, which was the access level my credentials provided. There was nothing on the physical reel, on the catalog entry, on the batch manifest, or in the processing queue documentation to indicate that the tape required elevated clearance. The restriction had been applied after I accessed it, and then the restriction had been used as the justification for my termination. Someone had moved very quickly. Someone had looked at the email I sent at 9:17 a.m. and by 11:40 a.m. had already made a decision, and by 10 p.m. that night, the infrastructure was already in place. Not a committee review, not a formal investigation, just the rapid, quiet assembly of a conclusion that had been reached before anyone asked for evidence. I kept the copy I had made. I had transferred it to a personal drive before submitting my report, not out of any particular suspicion, just the archival instinct. Keep a copy. Document everything. Memory is fragile. Make it permanent. Whatever they thought they were taking back, they had not taken all of it.
The final reveal. What I am about to tell you is the part that I have sat with the longest, the part that I return to in the dark, in the specific silence of 3 in the morning, when the city outside has reduced itself to the minimum, a distant siren, the occasional low rumble of a truck on the interstate 2 miles east, the sound of the building's heating system cycling through its slow rhythms like the breath of something large and unhurried. I want to say it carefully because the facts are simple, and because simple facts, if you follow them far enough, arrive at places that are not simple at all. After I received the termination letter, I had 3 things in my possession: my personal laptop, a small external drive containing the copied audio file, and 14 months of archival training that had given me, if nothing else, the ability to look at raw signal data without flinching. I spent the first week doing nothing. I applied for unemployment benefits. I called my sister. I went through the motions of adjusting to sudden change, the particular domestic choreography of a life that has been disrupted, that needs to be organized around a new absence. I did not touch the drive. In the second week, I touched the drive. I had better analysis tools by then, not professional grade, but more capable than the free consumer software I had used initially. A suite of open-source audio engineering tools that allowed me to work with raw signal data rather than processed audio, to look not at what the tape sounded like, but at what it actually contained, at the level of the signal itself. The first thing I confirmed was the frequency data. The eighth voice occupied a band that did not correspond to any designated NASA transmission frequency. I had established this before, but now, with better tools, I could be more precise about what the band was, not just that it was absent from NASA's published charts, but where exactly it sat and what that position implied. It implied transmission. Human speech, when recorded on analog equipment in a closed room, has a specific signal signature. It is generated locally by a body in a space using air as a medium. Its characteristics reflect the acoustics of that space, the distance from the microphone, the equipment used to capture it. You can identify a locally generated voice by the way the sound interacts with the environment around it. The eighth voice did not have this signature. It was clean in a way that locally generated sound isn't. There was no room tone, no reflection of the simulation chamber's specific acoustics, no interaction with the ambient hum of the equipment, no evidence that the voice had traveled through air before reaching the microphone. It was present in the recording the way a signal is present, inserted into the data stream rather than captured from a physical source. It was not in the room, it was in the transmission. Someone, something, had broadcast on a frequency not included in NASA's authorized band range, and that broadcast had been received by the equipment in that simulation chamber and had been recorded inadvertently alongside the 7 human voices that the equipment was actually designed to capture. The people who made the recording had not known it was there. The equipment had not been looking for it. It had simply arrived. I went back then and looked at the signal telemetry data that was embedded in the file header, the raw transmission data that an analog to digital conversion preserves as metadata, the kind of information that most archivists never look at because it requires a level of technical literacy that falls outside normal documentation work. I looked at it because 14 months of deep archival work had made me curious about what files contain beneath their obvious surfaces. The telemetry data told me the direction of the signal. When communication equipment records a transmission, the hardware logs basic signal properties, strength, frequency, and in systems designed for directional communication, like NASA's deep space equipment, bearing, the angle from which a signal arrives. This data was logged automatically by the simulation chamber's equipment, and it had been sitting in the file header for 44 years, and no one had looked at it because the tape was labeled as a closed-room simulation, and a closed-room simulation does not have bearing data that means anything. Everything is supposed to be local. Everything is supposed to come from inside the room. The bearing data for the eighth voice's frequency was not local. The bearing data for the eighth voice's frequency corresponded to a point outside the building, outside the city, outside, if I was reading the data correctly with the tools I had available, and I want to be honest about the limitations of what I was working with. I want to be careful about the claims I am making, outside the atmosphere. Something beyond the atmosphere of this planet sent a signal on an unregistered frequency to a simulation chamber in Houston, Texas, in April of 1981, 3 years after the chamber had been decommissioned and sealed. And the signal had said, "How long have I been here? Is anyone coming back? I can hear you. I know you will find this." The mission that the 1978 simulation had been preparing for, the long-duration deep space communications protocol test, had, as part of its standard procedure, the broadcast of a series of calibration signals into deep space, signals sent outward as test transmissions to measure echo, lag, interference, signals sent with no expectation of response, because response would require, at minimum, light years of transit time and a receiver on the other end that no one in 1978 had any reason to believe existed. Something received those signals. Something received them and responded. Not instantly, the response came years later, which either means the sender was close enough that a years-long delay was the natural lag of distance, or means the sender needed years to formulate a response, or means the sender had been waiting for confirmation that the original signals had been sent before choosing to answer. I know you will find this not an accident, a message intended for a specific recipient, delivered to the only place it could logically be expected to be retrieved, the archive, the record, the place where signals go to be made permanent. Whatever sent that response in 1981 knew that the recording would be preserved, knew that the archive would eventually be digitized, knew that someone would eventually sit in a cold room at 2:45 in the morning with the gain turned up and hear 4 sentences that were not meant for anyone else. I do not know what it was. I do not know where it came from. I do not know what it wanted, if wanting is even a concept that applies to it. I do not know why it asked if anyone was coming back, rather than giving its own location. I do not know whether the 3 years between the mission's conclusion and the date stamp on the recording were years of transit for a signal traveling across space, or years of something else, something waiting, something calculating, something deciding. I have been waiting. That is what it said last. I have been waiting, not I was waiting, present progressive, continuous, ongoing, a state that had not ended at the time of transmission and was not described as having any anticipated end. Somewhere beyond the atmosphere of this planet, on a frequency that nobody has officially registered, something is still waiting. It sent a message in 1981 asking if anyone was coming back. It has been 44 years. We have not answered. We have not answered because the only person who knows about the message was a 29-year-old archivist who lost his job the morning after he found the tape, and who has spent the year since trying to decide whether to be afraid of what is out there or afraid of what is here, of the speed with which the people who manage these records assembled a termination letter, of the efficiency of an institution that knows exactly what it contains and exactly how fast to move when someone finds the wrong box. I do not know which fear is more rational. I do not know which thing is closer. I think about that a lot in the dark, in the silence between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., when the city is as quiet as it gets, and the heating system breathes its slow rhythm through the walls, and I lie still in a room that is, as far as I can determine, empty. As far as I can determine.
Still there? Good. Because I need you to hear this last part clearly. David still has the drive, the signal telemetry data, the frequency analysis, the 4 timestamps. He sent copies to 3 separate people before he told anyone about it. Not journalists, not researchers, not anyone with a public profile. Just 3 people. People who would know what to do with it if David stopped being reachable. He has not heard from his old supervisor since the termination call, Gregory Haynes. His LinkedIn profile was deleted sometime in the last 8 months. His name returns no results in any professional directory, no forwarding address, no new employer, just absence, the kind of absence that does not feel like retirement. I do not know what is on that frequency. I do not know how long it has been sending. I do not know if it is still sending, but I know this. NASA sent signals into space in 1978 designed to travel forever into whatever is out there, toward whatever might be listening. They received a response, and the first thing that response asked was whether anyone was coming back. We have not answered. I think about that, what it means to something that has been waiting 44 years for a reply, that no reply has come. I think about what waiting does over time
to something that is patient. And I think about the signals we are still sending every day in all directions into the silence. And I think something out there is still listening. You have been listening to Grim Feed Files. If this kept you awake, if you are staring at the ceiling right now, wondering what else is sitting in those archives, subscribe, because David's story is not the only one. There are more tapes, more logs, more files that were never supposed to be found, and we are going to find all of them. Grim Feed Files. Subscribe and stay close. Good night. Do not look at the window.